Divorced and left in a lethal drought, she dug a deep earth air trench. Dr. Amos Bell, post surgeon through 21 desert summers, told her, "Keep those children in this box through July, and you will bury one before the month breaks." She had $11, 2 children, and a shack she could not cool or leave. On July 14, 1888, 111 degrees settled over the valley and held for 5 days. But 4 months earlier, Eliza Voss had never laid a pipe or set a grate in her life. She had arrived in the Verde country in March of 1888 with a husband who promised land, a mule that could still pull, and $11 folded inside a Bible she no longer opened. The claim sat east of the settlement road on a low bench of red earth, treeless except for a single dead cottonwood that leaned like a man shot standing. The shack was already there. Board walls, plank roof, one room 16 feet square, with a cook stove vented through a tin pipe that stuck from the roof line at an angle no one had bothered to correct. The previous owner had walked off owing the store $14 and leaving behind 3 cracked water crocks, a warped handcart, and a smell of mouse nests baked into the wood. By May, the husband was gone too. His name was Denton Voss, and he left on a freight outfit bound for Prescott, promising to send wages and a letter within the month. He took the mule. He left the handcart, the Bible, the $11, and the 2 children, Ruth, who was 9, and understood what had happened, and Owen, who was 5 and asked every morning when the mule was coming back. The letter never came. The wages never came. What came instead was June, and with June came heat that turned the shack into something closer to a kiln than a dwelling. By mid-June, Eliza understood her position with the kind of clarity that strips away every comfortable thought. She had $11. She had a milk goat that was nearly dry and 3 hens that laid less each week. She had 2 children, 1 cracked water barrel, no wagon team, no relatives within 500 miles, and a shack that absorbed heat through every board from sunrise until long after dark. The cook stove made a hot room murderous. She moved it outside, balanced on flat stones, and cooked before dawn. But the walls held yesterday's heat through the night, and the roof held it longer, and by noon even the floor burned Owen's feet through his socks. She could not afford shipped ice. The nearest ice house sat in Prescott, a 2-day journey she had no means to make. She could not build a porch or shade wall with $11 and no lumber. She could not simply open the windows wider because by midday the outdoor air was hotter than the air inside. And she could not leave. She had no wagon, no team, no money for passage, no family waiting anywhere. The claim was not a choice. It was the only ground left under her feet. 3 weeks after Denton disappeared, Dr. Amos Bell rode up on a bay mare, already dark with sweat. Bell was the post surgeon attached to Fort Verde, 21 summers stationed in desert country. He had watched teamsters collapse in wagon beds and stockmen crawl under mules for shade. He had treated infants whose fevers came not from illness, but from air that could not cool, and he had signed death certificates where the cause was simply heat and the contributing factor was poverty. He was not a cruel man. He was a precise one, and precision in his experience was kinder than hope. He came because a freighter had mentioned a woman alone on the east bench with small children and no team. He tied the mare to the dead cottonwood and walked the property the way a man walks a room where someone has already died, looking for the specifics of the failure. Eliza met him at the door. Owen sat behind her on the floor, shirtless, his skin blotched red along the shoulders. Bell did not introduce himself gently. He stepped inside, removed his hat, and the heat hit him like a hand across the face. He looked at the roof. Low, no vent, tin pipe sealed badly, tar already softening along the seams. He looked at the walls, single board, no gap, no shade on any side. He looked at the floor, packed dirt with planks laid loose, radiating upward. "You have a roof with no vent," Bell said. "You have boards taking sun all day with no shade on any face. You have no cellar and no second room. What you require is a lumber, labor, and a wagon, and you possess none of those things. Eliza said nothing. Belle crouched beside Owen and pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck. He lifted the child's eyelid. He looked at Eliza. How long has he been flushed like this? 4 days, Eliza said. He vomited yesterday and the day before. Belle stood. He walked to the water crock and dipped his hand. The water was warm enough to wash dishes. If you keep those children in this box through July, Belle said, you will bury one before the month breaks. He said it the way he said everything, not to wound, but because he believed the truth spoken plainly was the only charitable thing left when the situation had passed charity. He was right by every measure he possessed. A single-board shack with no ventilation, no shade, no cellar, and no means of alteration was not a dwelling in July heat. It was an oven with a family inside it. I can write to the territorial relief agent, Belle said. There may be a place for the children in Prescott if passage can be arranged. The children stay with me, Eliza said. Then you must find a way to cool this room or leave it, Belle said. Those are your choices, and neither one is easy. He left a tin of salve for Owen's skin and a folded instruction for heat treatment, wet rags on the neck and wrists, small sips of water with a pinch of salt, shade during peak hours. Eliza read the instructions and looked at the room. There was no shade during peak hours. The room was peak hours. She sat on the floor beside Owen after Belle rode away and pressed her back against the wall. The boards were hot through her dress. Ruth stood at the window watching the dust from Belle's mare settle back onto the road. Are we going to Prescott? Ruth asked. No, Eliza said. Then what are we going to do? Eliza did not answer because she did not have an answer. She had $11, a dying goat, 3 hens, 2 children, and a verdict from a man who had watched people die in heat for 21 years. Every conventional path led to the same place, debt, dispossession, or a small grave dug into red dirt. The math did not work. The math had not worked since Denton took the mule and vanished into Prescott like smoke into a clean sky. But the next morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, Eliza walked down to the wash below the claim. She went to retrieve a water crock she had cached in the shaded cut, where the bank overhung by 3 feet. The shade was thin, but it was real, and she had learned to stash water there because it stayed cooler than anything left in the shack. She knelt and pulled the crock from the sandy depression, and as she did, she felt something that stopped her. Air, cool air, moving against her forearm. It came from a crack in the bank where an animal burrow had intersected a broken length of clay drain tile, the kind of vitrified pipe the ditch crews left behind when they abandoned a repair. The tile was half buried, angled slightly downward into the bank, and the air seeping from its mouth was cool enough to raise the hairs on Eliza's wrist. She held her hand there for 10 seconds. 15. The air did not stop. It moved like slow breath, drawn from somewhere below the scorch line where the sun could not follow, and something turned inside her memory like a key finding its lock. Her mother's brother, a man named Prosper Cheney, had worked as a kiln burner and ditch repairer outside Independence before the war. When Eliza was 9 or 10, Prosper had taken her to a clay culvert he was patching and told her to put one hand on the sun-baked stone above the trench and the other hand inside the buried pipe. The stone had burned. The pipe had breathed cool. Prosper had said the ground keeps its own temperature, that 6 feet down the earth does not care what the sky is doing, and that a man who understood this could move air where the sun could not reach it. She had been a child. She had filed it the way children file things adults say, without understanding, but with the sensory memory locked tight, red dust on bare ankles, the mineral smell of damp clay, sunlight like a hammer on the back of her neck, and under her forearm, inside that buried pipe, air that felt almost wet with coolness. Now she crouched in a desert wash with the same feeling against her wrist and the same principle assembling itself in her mind. If the earth 6 feet down stayed cooler than the air above, and it did, she could feel it, Then a pipe buried deep enough and run long enough would cool the air passing through it. If the shack had a vent cut high in the roof, the hottest air would rise and escape. The rising air would pull replacement air through the buried pipe. The replacement air would arrive cool. The shack would breathe, not from the murderous sky, but from the ground. She sat back on her heels and looked at the broken tile. It was 4 inches across, vitrified clay, cracked at one end but solid through the middle. She counted. 4 sections visible in the bank, each roughly 2 feet long. She would need far more than 4 sections. She would need the pipe to run 50 feet or better, buried 6 feet deep at the cabin end to catch the coolest earth, grated slightly so the air moved without pooling. She would need to cut a hole low in the cabin floor for the cool air to enter and a vent high in the roof for the hot air to leave. She would need to seal every joint so the pipe did not suck in hot surface air or dirt along its length. She had no shovel rated for 6 feet in baked desert ground. She had no mason to set the joints. She had no one to help her dig, no money to hire diggers, and Dr. Bell's words still ringing like a bell rope in her skull. You will bury one before the month breaks. But she had felt the air. The ground was cool where the sun could not touch it. That was not opinion. That was not faith. That was physics. And physics did not care whether she had a mule or a husband or $11. Eliza climbed out of the wash and walked back toward the shack. She did not tell Ruth what she was thinking. She did not tell anyone. She found the hand cart with its warped wheel and dragged it to the wash and loaded the 4 sections of tile. Then she walked the old ditch line east for a quarter mile until she found a broken-out section where the repair crew had left more pipe, cracked pieces, half lengths, a few that were whole. She loaded 8 more sections, 12 pieces total. Maybe 24 feet of usable pipe if the cracks could be sealed. She needed 50 feet. She had 24. She had no shovel good enough, no sealing compound, no one who believed a trench full of buried clay pipe could save her children from a post-surgeon's forecast. She started digging that afternoon with a flat spade and a grubbing hoe. The ground fought her from the first stroke. 6 inches down, the red earth turned to cate. Hardpan clay baked to the consistency of soft stone. The grubbing hoe bounced, the spade edge chipped. Eliza swung with her full weight and opened a gash in the earth maybe 2 inches deep and 8 inches long. At that rate, 50 feet of trench 6 feet deep would take her the rest of the summer, and summer was the thing she was racing. She worked the first day until her palms split along the base of each finger. She wrapped them in strips cut from a flour sack, soaked the wraps in warm water, and kept swinging. By sundown, she had opened 4 feet of trench to a depth of maybe 2 feet, 46 feet to go, and not deep enough on any of it. Ruth brought water. Owen sat in the shade of the hand cart, still flushed, watching his mother hit the ground with a rhythm that sounded like someone knocking on a door that would not open. On the 3rd day, Nora Pritchard walked over from the neighboring claim. Nora was 36, married to a stock rancher named Curtis, who ran cattle on the open range south of the creek. She was a practical woman who had survived 3 Arizona summers by keeping wet sheets over the windows and spending the worst hours lying still on the dirt floor of her root cellar. She had heard about the trench from a freighter's boy who had seen Eliza digging. She stood at the edge of the cut and looked down at Eliza, who was waist deep in a slot barely wide enough to turn around in. "What are you digging for?" Nora asked. "Air," Eliza said. Nora looked at the pipe section stacked beside the trench mouth. She looked at the line Eliza had scratched in the dirt with a stick, running from the wash cut all the way to the shack wall 50 feet away. She looked back at Eliza. "If you have the strength to dig 50 feet, Nora said, you should dig for water. At least water can be drunk." "I can't drink shade either," Eliza said, "but my children need it." "There's no shade in a pipe, Eliza. There's cool air in the ground. I felt it." Nora shook her head slowly, the way a woman shakes her head when she has decided something is not worth arguing about because the person arguing is already lost. Curtis says the heat this summer will be worse than 86, Nora said. In 86, 2 children died at the camp on Beaver Creek. Their mother had done everything right, and they still died. You're not doing everything right. You're digging a ditch for air. She left a jar of buttermilk on the flat stone near the trench. It was kindness wrapped in judgment, and Eliza drank it standing in the trench with dirt on her face and blood seeping through the flour sack on her right hand. Nora's doubt was the kind that hurt worst because it was reasonable. A woman alone with 2 children and $11 should spend every ounce of strength on water, food, and finding passage out. Digging a 50-foot trench for air sounded like grief turned to madness. Eliza knew how it looked. She could feel how it looked every time she climbed out of the trench and saw Ruth's face, careful, still, watching her mother the way a child watches when she has begun to wonder if the adults have stopped making sense. But Eliza had felt the air in the wash. She had felt it against her wrist, constant and cool, drawn from ground that the sun had never touched. The air was real. The principle was real. The question was whether she could move it from the wash to the shack before the heat killed someone first. And then, on the 6th day, Silas Red came. Red ran the trading post and lending counter at the settlement crossroads, a mile and a half west. He was 43, thin through the chest, with a ledger book he carried in a leather case the way other men carried rifles. He was not the richest man in the Verde country, but he was the most patient, and his patience was the kind that fed on other people's desperation. He held notes on 4 claims in the corridor. 2 of those claims had been signed over to him when the owners could not pay. He had sold one at a profit and sat on the other, waiting for the road to improve. Silas knew about Eliza. He knew her husband had left. He knew she had no team, no income, and no practical way to reach Prescott. He knew she had 2 children and $11. He had known all of this within a week of Denton's departure, because Silas made it his business to know the exact weight pressing on every claim holder within 10 miles, the same way a man who poisons coyotes knows which water holes are visited at night. He rode up on a mule, his own, well-fed, the kind of animal that announced its owner had means, and found Eliza in the trench. She was 8 feet into the cut now, the walls above her shoulders, her dress dark with sweat, and red dust ground into the fabric so deep it would never wash clean. Silas dismounted and stood at the edge, looking down. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I heard you were improving the property." Eliza did not stop digging. The grubbing hoe rose and fell, rose and fell. "I came to offer terms," Silas said. $5 against your improvements, payable by September 1st. If you cannot repay, the shack and claim revert to me. Fair terms, better than you'll find. "I don't need credit," Eliza said. "You need a great deal more than credit," Silas said. "You need pipe, a roof vent, ceiling clay, and about 40 more feet of trench. You need a strong back you do not have and time you're running out of. What I am offering is a way out before this buries you." He paused. 2 neighbors, a stock hand named Worley and Nora's husband Curtis, had stopped on the road to watch. "No decent mother," Silas said loud enough to carry, "would gamble on dirt and pipe when her children are already sick." Eliza stopped digging. She looked up at Silas. The sun was behind him and she had to squint, but her voice came out level and clear. "My children are my concern," she said. "Your $5 is yours. Keep it." Silas smiled the way a man smiles when he has just placed a bet he expects to collect. "By September," he said, "you will wish you had taken it." He rode away. Worley and Curtis watched him go, then looked at Eliza standing in a trench that went nowhere yet, holding a grubbing hoe with bloody rags on both hands, and they looked at each other the way men look at each other when they have already decided something is finished. But Eliza did not climb out of the trench. She set the hoe against the wall, picked up the flat spade, and kept cutting. The work grew harder in the second week, and the heat grew worse to match it. By day 8, Eliza had opened 18 feet of trench. The first 12 ran shallow, 3 to 4 feet, because the kaite layer resisted her tools, and she could not break through without a proper pick. The last 6 feet she had managed to deepen to 5 feet by finding a seam of softer alluvial clay, where the old wash had once cut closer to the surface. But the trench was uneven, the grade was uncertain, and she had no way to check whether the pipe would fall true from intake to cabin. She needed help. Not charity, not Silas Red's $5 with a claim attached, but someone who understood pipe and grade and clay and would see what she was trying to build instead of what everyone else saw, which was a woman digging her own grave. On the 9th morning, she found him. She had walked east along the old ditch line to scavenge more pipe sections, dragging the handcart with its warped wheels screaming on the axle. A quarter-mile past her claim, she found a section of collapsed irrigation ditch where someone had been repairing the grade. Fresh tool marks in the bank. A plumb line still hanging from a stake. A pile of sorted pipe sections arranged by length and condition. A man sat on an overturned crate beside the pile, eating cold tortilla with one hand and holding a joint of pipe in the other, turning it slowly, inspecting the glaze. He was 58, brown-skinned, thick through the shoulders in the way of men who have spent decades swinging and lifting. His hair was iron gray under a flat-brimmed hat stained white with salt along the band. His hands were scarred across the knuckles and palms, old burns from kiln work layered over newer calluses from shovel and tamping bar. His name was Mateo Salazar. He had worked kilns in Sonora, then ditch and flue construction in the territory for 15 years. He could set a pipe grade by eye and confirm it by water level within a quarter inch over 100 feet. He had built flue runs for smelters, irrigation feeds for ranches, and drainage lines for mine works. He knew clay the way a carpenter knows wood, its moods, its limits, where it would hold and where it would betray. Eliza stopped the handcart. Mateo looked at her hands, the flour sack wraps, the blood-dried brown, the red dust packed into every crack. "You are digging," he said. "Yes." "For what?" Eliza told him. She told him about the shack, the heat, the children, the air in the wash, the buried tile, the principle her uncle had taught her as a child. She told him about the 50-foot run from the wash cut to the cabin wall, the plan for a low inlet through the floor and a high vent through the roof, and the need for sealed joints so the pipe drew only buried air and not hot surface leakage. Mateo listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the pipe joint and the tortilla and stood up. "Show me your trench," he said. They walked back together. Mateo descended into the cut and ran his hand along the wall. He crouched and sighted down the floor of the trench the way a man sights down a rifle barrel. He stood and kicked the dirt at the shallow end. "Your grade is almost right," he said. "Almost is not right. If the line bellies, the air pools and the draw dies. You need a water level and a cord." "I don't have a water level." "I do." He looked at her. His eyes were dark and quiet. The eyes of a man who had built things in heat his whole life and had learned that the heat does not negotiate. "You understand the principle. That is more than most. But understanding and building are different animals. Your joints will leak if you seal them wrong. Your vent will fail if it sits too low. Your whole line is useless if the grade is not true. Will you help me?" "I do not give charity," Mateo said. "But you are the first person in this settlement trying to move heat instead of merely sitting in it. That interests me." He returned the next morning with a water level made from a clear glass tube and 2 stakes, a tamping bar, a bucket of mixed clay, and a sack of chopped straw. The real work began. Matteo taught through doing, not explaining. He set the first lesson on grade the same hour he arrived. He drove a stake at the trench head near the wash and another at the cabin end. Between them, he ran a cord pulled taut. Then he hung the water level, a glass tube bent into a U, half filled, mounted between two flat sticks, and walked the cord, checking where the line of water sat at each point. "The pipe must fall," he said. "Not much. A finger's width over 10 feet is enough. But it must fall true from intake to outlet. If it rises anywhere, the air meets a wall." He adjusted the cord 3 times. Each time, Eliza watched where his hands went, how he read the water, how he scraped a mark on the stake with his knife. By the 3rd adjustment, she understood the principle. The cord was not a measurement. It was a promise that gravity would pull the air the same direction as the water. "Now dig to the cord," Matteo said. "Not below, not above, to the cord." She dug. He watched. When she cut too deep, he told her. When the wall began to lean, he showed her how to widen the shoulder and brace soft sections with plank scraps set crosswise. He did not take the shovel from her hands. He stood above and corrected. The way a man teaches a craft he respects too much to do for someone who can learn it. The second lesson was joint sealing. Matteo showed her how to knead clay with chopped straw and wood ash until it became a dense, fibrous paste that would shrink tight as it dried rather than cracking open. He packed the first collar himself, a ring of paste pressed into the gap between 2 pipe sections, then smoothed with the heel of his hand and tamped with the flat of the bar until the joint sat solid in its bedding. "The joint is the life of the line," he said. "If it leaks, you pull dirt. Dirt blocks flow. Blocked flow means no air. Every joint must hold, or the whole run is a buried hole." Eliza sealed the second joint herself. Matteo watched, adjusted her hand position once, and nodded. By the end of the first day with Matteo, they had corrected the grade on the existing 18 feet, sealed 4 joints, and laid 9 feet of new pipe in a section of trench Eliza had deepened to nearly 6 feet. 27 feet of the 50 were now cut and partially fitted. 23 remained, and July was 12 days away. The children adapted. Ruth carried water from the barrel to the trench in a tin pail, walking the path so many times that she wore a trail into the dust. Owen sorted pipe shards by size, sitting in the meager shade of the handcart, still flushed, but no longer vomiting since Eliza had moved his sleeping pallet outside under a rigged canvas after dark. Family labor became visible, not as exploitation, but as the kind of shared desperation that turns even a 5-year-old into someone with a job. On day 11, the trench wall collapsed. They were working the deepest section, the run nearest the cabin, where the trench needed to reach full depth for maximum cooling, when a vertical slab of brittle clay sheared off the east wall and buried 3 newly laid pipe sections under 400 pounds of dirt. The collapse came without warning. One moment the wall stood. The next it folded like a page in a book, and Eliza jumped backward, and the dirt filled the trench to her knees. She stood in the debris and did not move. The 3 buried sections represented an entire day's fitting and sealing. The joints might be cracked. The pipe might be shifted off grade. She would have to excavate, inspect every piece, reseal anything that had moved, and regrade the floor. A full day lost at minimum, possibly 2. Matteo climbed down. He pulled 1 pipe section free and checked the joint. Intact. He checked the second. A hairline crack in the seal, but repairable. He looked at the sheared wall and pointed to the layer of pale calcium deposits that marked the weakness. "Widen the shoulder here," he said. "Cut the wall back to solid ground, then crib with plank scraps. You lose width, but you keep the wall." "I don't have enough planks." "Then find them. There's always scrap somewhere. A woman who can dig this trench can find 2 boards. It was not comfort. It was instruction, and Eliza understood the difference. Mateo respected her too much to tell her everything would be fine. He respected her enough to tell her what to do next. She found the planks, scavenged from a collapsed freight loading platform half a mile east, and braced the soft section by torchlight while Ruth held a candle, and Owen slept in the shack with wet rags draped over his chest. 13 days since she had started digging. 32 feet of trench cut and graded, 18 feet remaining. The first joints were sealed and the pipe sat true on Mateo's cord line, but the roof vent was not built. The intake box was not screened, and the June heat had not yet reached what July would bring. On day 15, Mateo helped her frame the roof vent, a simple wooden collar with a raised cap that would let hot air escape upward while keeping rain and dust from falling in. They mounted it above the ridgeline, where the tin pipe already pierced the roof, widening the opening and setting the collar high enough to clear the interior heat layer by a good 2 feet. That night, a dust squall tore the first cap loose and flung it into the yard. Eliza found it at dawn, cracked along one face. The mounting peg snapped. She sat on the ground beside it with the broken cap in her lap and her hands shaking, not from effort, but from the accumulated weight of 18 days of digging, 2 weeks of doubt, Silas Redd's smile, Nora Pritchard's head shake, and Dr. Amos Bell's voice saying, "You will bury one before the month breaks." Ruth came out and sat beside her. Can you fix it?" Ruth asked. Eliza looked at the cap. She looked at the shack. She looked at the trench running 50 feet toward the wash. 32 feet finished, 18 to go, and a roof vent that had lasted exactly one night. "Yes," Eliza said, "I can fix it." She carried the cap to Mateo that morning. He showed her how to set the mounting pegs deeper and brace the upwind face with a strip of tin folded double. They rebuilt the cap in 2 hours. They remounted it by noon. And this time, when the wind came, it held. 18 feet of trench remained. July was 6 days away. The shack still held yesterday's heat through every board, and the floor still burned through socks by noon. But 32 feet of buried pipe lay sealed and graded in a line from the wash to the cabin wall, and a roof vent stood above the ridgeline, waiting to pull the hottest air skyward and draw something cooler up from the earth. Whether that something cooler would be enough to keep 2 children alive was a question the trench could not answer yet. Only July could answer it. And July was coming the way it always came in the Verde country, not slowly, not gently, but like a furnace door swinging open on a room that had no other exit. The 18th of June broke hot and still, and Eliza was in the trench by first light. Mateo had shown her the third lesson the evening before, draft management. He had climbed onto the shack roof, braced himself against the tin pipe, and pointed to the vent collar they had rebuilt. "The vent must rise clean above the heat layer inside," he said. "Hot air collects at the ceiling. If the vent sits too low, it pulls warm air from the middle of the room and never touches the hottest layer. The draw stays weak. The pipe never pulls hard." He measured with his hand. 2 feet above the ridgeline was the minimum. Their collar stood at 22 inches. Close. But close was not enough. "Raise it 4 inches, Mateo said, "and angle the cap so wind from any quarter pushes across the throat, not into it. Wind across the opening creates suction. Wind into the opening creates pressure that fights the draw." He shaped the correction with his hands in the failing light, showing how a beveled cap edge would turn crosswind into pull instead of push. Eliza watched his fingers and understood. The system was not just buried pipe and a hole in the roof. It was a machine. The pipe was the intake. The room was the chamber. The vent was the exhaust. And like any machine, every part had to be sized and placed to serve the whole. They raised the collar the next morning using a scavenged fence post as a riser and tin strips bent around the joint. 4 inches. The cap now stood 26 inches above the ridgeline, angled to catch the prevailing westerly and convert it into upward draw. Now the system has a throat, Matteo said. When the pipe is finished, it will have a lung. 18 feet of trench remained. Eliza started on the deepest section, the final run to the cabin wall, where the pipe had to sit a full 6 feet below grade to reach the coolest earth. The kite layer here was harder than anything she'd cut before. The grubbing hoe bounced and rang. She switched to the tamping bar, driving it point down into the hard pan, cracking the surface into chunks she could pry loose with the spade. Each foot of depth cost an hour. Each hour cost water she could not easily replace. Ruth took over the water runs entirely now. She walked to the communal cistern half a mile west with 2 crocks hung from a yoke Matteo had shaped from a cottonwood branch. And she walked back with the crocks full, and she did this twice a day without complaint. She was 9 years old, and her shoulders were already beginning to set in the squared, forward-leaning posture of a person who carries weight. Owen improved slightly once Eliza moved his sleeping place outdoors under rigged canvas. The night air was not cool, but it was cooler than the shack interior, and the slight movement of air across his skin kept his temperature from climbing the way it had when he slept indoors. He still flushed by midday. He still moved slowly, a 5-year-old walking with the careful economy of an old man in August. But he stopped vomiting, and his eyes cleared, and that was enough for now. On day 17, Eliza and Matteo hit a seam ophitate rock, calcium deposit cemented into a shelf 6 inches thick at exactly the depth the pipe needed to run. Matteo struck it with the tamping bar, and the bar bounced back hard enough to sting his hands. "We go through it, or we go around it," he said. Going through meant hours of hammering. Going around meant a deviation in the trench line that would add 5 feet to the run and require a curved pipe section they did not have. "Through," Eliza said. They broke the shelf with alternating strikes, Matteo with the bar, Eliza with the grubbing hoe, working in a rhythm that sounded like a slow heartbeat echoing off the trench walls. The calcium fractured in slabs. Eliza hauled the slabs out by hand, stacking them on the surface where they would later serve as heat shields propped against the shack's south wall. Nothing wasted, everything repurposed. By the 20th day, the trench was 43 feet long. 7 feet remained. The pipe sections were laid and sealed through the first 38 feet, joints packed tight with Matteo's clay straw ash compound, bedding tamped firm beneath each section. Eliza could stand at the trench head near the wash and sight down the line of pipe, like looking through a telescope, the bore narrowing to a dark circle at the far end where it would soon enter the cabin. But 7 feet remained, and those 7 feet were the most critical. They ran directly beneath the cabin floor. To connect the buried pipe to the room, Eliza had to cut through the foundation sill, bore under the floor joists, and bring the pipe mouth up through a hole cut in the floorboards. The cool air had to enter the room low, at floor level or just above, because cool air sinks and warm air rises, and the whole system depended on the replacement air spreading across the floor while the hot air escaped through the roof vent above. Matteo showed her how to make the cut. He marked the sill with charcoal, drilled a starter hole with a brace, and bit borrowed from Curtis Pritchard's barn, and let Eliza saw the opening herself. The wood was dry and hard, and the saw blade caught and jumped. She cut her thumb on the second stroke, wrapped it without stopping, and finished the opening in 40 minutes. The pipe entered the cabin on a slight upward angle, just enough to keep rain from pooling in the bore, and emerged through a square hole in the floorboards that Matteo framed with scrap wood to keep the edges from splintering. "Seal the floor joint," he said. "Clay and straw, same as the pipe. If air leaks in around the edges, you lose draw." She sealed it. She tamped it. She smoothed the surface with the heel of her hand until the joint between pipe and floor looked like it had grown there. On the 21st day, they built the intake box. The intake sat at the wash end of the line where the pipe opened into the shaded cut below the bank. Matteo constructed a simple wooden frame, 18 inches square, slatted on 3 sides for airflow, screened with fine cloth on the 4th to keep animals and insects from entering the bore. He set it in the deepest part of the shade, where the overhang blocked direct sun for all but 30 minutes at peak noon. The intake must breathe, he said, but it must not swallow. Cloth screen, not open slats. Anything that enters the pipe, a mouse, a snake, a bird, blocks the bore and kills the flow. Eliza staked the screen tight and weighted the frame with flat stones. She knelt and put her face near the mouth of the pipe, where it entered the box. Nothing. No movement. No air. The system is not connected yet, Matteo said. The vent cap is sealed for the night. Open the cap, and the draw begins. She walked back to the cabin, climbed the roof, pulled the sealing plug from the vent collar, and waited. For 2 minutes, nothing happened. The room sat heavy with trapped heat. Owen lay on the floor near the pipe opening, watching the dark mouth of the bore, the way a child watches a hole where an animal might live. Then Owen said, "Mama, it's cold." Not cold, not truly, but cool. A ribbon of air moving from the pipe mouth across the floorboards, perceptible against bare skin, different from every other breath of air in that room. The buried pipe had done what Prosper Cheney said the ground would do. It had taken the air and held it against cooler earth for 50 feet and released it into the room, carrying the temperature of the soil instead of the temperature of the sky. Eliza knelt beside the opening and felt it against her wrist. The same feeling as the wash, the same slow breath from underground, the same principle now captured and delivered. She did not celebrate. She pressed her hand flat against the floorboard beside the opening and felt the air move between her fingers, and she stayed there for a long time, breathing. The system worked. The question was whether it worked enough. In the days after completion, Eliza tested and measured in the only ways available to her. She hung a wet rag near the pipe outlet and watched it stir, barely, but it stirred, which meant air was moving. She placed her cheek against the floorboards at different points and mapped where the cool spread and where it did not. Near the pipe opening, the air was noticeably cooler. 4 feet away, the effect thinned. At the far wall, she could not detect it. Matteo was unsurprised. "The room is too large for one bore," he said. "One pipe cools the sleeping area, not a house. If you want the whole room, you need 2 intakes. If you want comfort, you need 3. "I have one," Eliza said. "Then your children sleep near the vent," Matteo said, "and you sleep between them and the heat." She rearranged the room. The sleeping pallets went beside the pipe opening. The cook stove stayed outside. The water crocks moved to the coolest corner. Ruth and Owen slept that night on the floor near the low vent, and for the first time in weeks, Owen did not wake flushed and crying at midnight. But the full test had not come. June's heat was brutal, but June was not July. The old hands in the settlement, the freighters, the cattlemen, the women who had buried children in summer ground, all said the same thing. June is the warning, July is the verdict. Dr. Bell returned on the 26th of June. He had come to check on Owen, he said. He had also come, Eliza suspected, to see whether she was still alive, still on the claim, or whether the shack sat empty and the children had been sent to Prescott the way he had recommended. He found Eliza on the roof, adjusting the vent cap with a wrench Matteo had lent her. He found Owen on the floor inside, sleeping in the middle of the day, which alarmed him until he entered the room and felt the air. Bell stopped 2 steps inside the door. He removed his hat. He looked at the ceiling, then at the floor. He walked to the pipe opening and crouched. He held his hand over the bore and felt the draft. "What is this?" he said. "Buried pipe," Eliza said from the roof. 50 feet from the wash, 6 feet deep. The ground cools the air. The vent pulls it through. Bell stood and looked at the vent collar above him. He looked at the pipe opening below. He was a surgeon, not an engineer, but he understood the movement of air. He had ventilated hospital tents and field camps and knew that hot air rises and replacement air must come from somewhere. "Cooler," he said. "I will grant you it is cooler." "Cooler is alive," Eliza said. "Cooler is not the same as safe in a killing week," Bell said. "When the heat settles and the nights stop cooling, your pipe will deliver warmer air because the ground itself will heat. You have built a delay, not a solution." "How long a delay?" "I do not know. I'm not an engineer. But I know that 2 children cannot survive on a delay if the delay runs out in the wrong week." He checked Owen's pulse, his skin, his eyes. The boy was better. Bell could see it. But better and safe were not the same word, and Bell had spent 21 years learning the distance between them. "I will come back in July," Bell said. "If the children are still like this, you may be right. If they are not, you will need to accept my offer for Prescott." He left. Eliza watched him ride away and felt the familiar weight settle, the weight of being right enough to continue and not right enough to be believed. Nora came the next day. She did not come to mock or to measure. She came with a burlap sack full of dried grass and a question. "Is it truly cooler in there?" "Feel it yourself," Eliza said. Nora stepped inside. She stood still for 10 seconds. Then she walked to the pipe opening and crouched, the way Bell had, and held her hand over the bore. "Lord," Nora said softly. "It's not enough for the whole room," Eliza said, "but it's enough for the children." Nora looked at her. Something shifted behind her eyes. The expression of a woman recalculating a judgment she had already settled. "Curtis would never let me dig a trench," Nora said. "Curtis doesn't have to dig it," Eliza said. "You do." Nora left the burlap sack, which turned out to contain 8 pounds of dried corn and a slab of salt pork. She did not call it charity, and Eliza did not call it an apology. It sat between them as what it was, a woman adjusting the distance between doubt and belief by the length of a burlap sack. The last days of June passed. The sky pressed down white and flat. The wash ran thinner. Stock ponds contracted, leaving rings of cracked mud like the growth lines on a felled tree. Cattle bunched under any object that threw a shadow. Dogs dug shallow trenches and lay in them with their tongues out, panting at a rhythm that sounded like counting. The system ran. The cool air moved through the pipe in a slow, steady draft, entering the room low and spreading across the floorboards, and the hot air rose through the vent collar and disappeared into the white sky. It was not a miracle. It was a buried pipe and a hole in the roof, and the principle that the earth keeps its own temperature when everything above it has gone to ruin. But it was running, and the children slept near it, and they were alive. Then July came. The heat siege began on the 14th of July, 1888, and it did not break for 5 days. The morning of the 14th dawned still, which was the first warning. Wind in the Verde country is constant, a dry westerly that carries dust and the smell of sage and keeps the air in motion even when the motion brings no relief. When the wind dies, the air stacks. The temperature does not just rise. It locks into place and presses down like a hand on a chest. By 8 in the morning, the shade temperature was 97 degrees. By 10, it had passed 104. By noon, the ground outside Eliza's shack was hot enough to blister bare skin on contact, and the air above it rippled and buckled so that the ridge to the west looked like something seen through old glass. Owen felt it first. He grew quiet at breakfast and did not finish his corn mush. By mid-morning, he was lying beside the pipe vent with his cheek pressed to the floorboards, breathing the cool air the way a drowning person breathes at a surface crack. Ruth sat beside him, fanning him with a folded piece of canvas, her own face sheened with sweat. Eliza checked the draw. She held a strip of cloth over the vent collar outside and watched it pull upward, flutter, and catch. The system was working, the hot air rising through the collar and the buried air following it into the room. She pressed her wrist to the pipe opening on the floor. Cool. Not cold, not even truly comfortable, but different enough from the air 4 feet above it to matter. "Stay low," she told Ruth. "Keep Owen near the vent. Wet his wrists and neck. Small sips." She went outside to check the intake. The walk from the cabin door to the wash cut was 50 yards, and in those 50 yards the heat struck her like stepping into the mouth of a kiln. The air was dry and violent and tasted of scorched mineral. Her dress dried from sweat-soaked to stiff in the time it took to reach the wash. The intake box sat in shade, the cloth screen intact, the pipe mouth drawing slow and steady. She could feel the pull against her hand. The system was alive. But day 1 was only the door opening. Day 2, the shade temperature reached 109. The chickens would not leave the space beneath the water barrel. The goat stood with her head lowered, sides heaving, producing no milk. The water barrel itself was warm to the touch, and Eliza rationed it, a half cup per person per hour, no more. She calculated. At that rate, the barrel would last 4 days. The cistern was a half-mile away, and the walk in this heat would cost more water and sweat than she could carry back. Inside, the buried line held. The air at the pipe opening moved steadily across the floorboards, cool enough that Owen's skin felt normal when Eliza pressed her palm to his forehead. The room was not comfortable. It was dim and close, and the upper air near the ceiling was hot enough to feel on an upraised hand. But at floor level, where the children lay, the air moved and the temperature held. And that gap, that distance between the floor and the ceiling, between the earth's memory and the sky's fury, was the margin of life. Mateo came in the afternoon of day 2. He was moving slowly, a man of 58 in heat that punished younger bodies. He checked the vent collar, checked the intake, checked the pipe outlet. He put his hand on the floor beside the vent and held it there. "The ground is doing its work," he said. "The draw is steady. As long as the vent holds and the joints do not leak, the system will run." "How long can it run?" "As long as there is a difference between the ground and the air. In this heat, that difference is large. The earth is your ally when the sky is your enemy." He sat with the children for an hour, telling Owen a story about a lizard that lived inside a cool rock and came out only at night. Owen listened with his eyes half closed, breathing the floor air, and Mateo's voice was low and even and carried the quality of a man who understood that stillness in heat is not laziness, but discipline. On the evening of day 2, the dust squall came. It was not a proper storm, no rain, no relief, just a wall of hot wind that rolled down the valley from the northwest, carrying fine red dust that coated every surface and forced its way through every crack. Eliza sealed the windows with wet cloth. She stuffed rags into the gaps between the floorboards. She covered the pipe opening with a thin cloth so the children would not breathe grit, but the vent collar took the hit directly. The wind hammered the cap from the west, and the beveled edge that Mateo had designed to convert crosswind into draw instead caught a direct gust that lifted the cap a quarter inch from its seating. The cap did not tear free, the deeper mounting pegs held, but it shifted enough to open a gap along one side, and through that gap, Hot surface air roared down into the vent collar and met the rising interior air. The draw reversed. Inside the cabin, Eliza felt it before she understood it. The cool ribbon of air from the pipe weakened, stuttered, and stopped. The room temperature began climbing immediately. Without the upward pull from the vent, the buried pipe had no reason to push air into the room. The system went still. Owen whimpered. Ruth pressed closer to the pipe opening and said, "Mama, it stopped." Eliza looked at the ceiling. She could feel the hot air stacking above her, thickening, pressing down. The room was becoming what Belle had called it, a box with a family inside it and a desert on top. She had to get to the roof. The dust squall was still blowing. The air outside was 107 degrees and full of grit. The roof was tin and board, heated all day, hot enough to burn through boot leather. And the vent collar sat at the highest point, 26 inches above the ridgeline, accessible only by the ladder Mateo had leaned against the south wall. Eliza wrapped her hands in wet rags. She told Ruth to keep Owen near the pipe opening, even though it had stopped drawing. She stepped outside and the heat hit her like walking into a forge. The dust stung her face and arms. She squinted and crossed to the ladder. Mateo was there. He had not left. He stood at the base of the ladder, his face wrapped in a bandana against the dust, his hands on the side rails. "The cap shifted," he shouted over the wind. "I saw it move. I have to reset it. I will brace the ladder. Go." She climbed. The tin roof burned through her shoes. She could feel the heat through the soles like standing on a cookstove lid. She moved on hands and knees, the wet rags on her hands sizzling against the tin, the rags drying in seconds, the metal underneath raising welts on her palms through the cloth. The vent collar was 6 feet from the edge. She crawled to it. The cap sat crooked, the western edge lifted, hot air pouring into the throat instead of being pulled from it. She could see the gap, a 1/4 inch of daylight between the cap base and the collar lip, enough to ruin everything. She pressed the cap down with both hands. The metal burned through the rags, and she felt it in the meat of her palms, a deep searing pain that made her vision narrow, but she held the cap flush and felt for the mounting pegs with her fingertips. One peg had jumped its hole. She worked it back, pressing with her thumb, the wind shoving against her back, the dust coating her arms in a fine red layer that mixed with the sweat and turned to paste. The peg seated. The cap sat flat. She held it for 10 seconds to be sure, then released. The wind crossed the beveled edge and the draw resumed. She could feel it through the collar, a pull of air rising from below. The system catching breath again, like a chest that had been held underwater and finally surfaced. From below, Mateo shouted, "Is it drawing?" "It's drawing," Eliza said. She did not shout. She said it to the sky and the dust and the merciless white sun, and she meant it the way a woman means any statement that stands between her children and a verdict she refuses to accept. She climbed down. Her palms were blistered in 3 places. Mateo looked at them and said nothing. He handed her a tin of salve from his vest pocket, the same kind of salve Belle had left for Owen weeks ago. "Go inside," he said. "Stay low." She went inside. The cool air was moving again. Owen lay on the floor near the pipe opening, his breathing steady, his skin warm but not burning. Ruth had pressed her own face to the floorboards and was breathing the floor air with her eyes closed. And when Eliza lay down beside them, she could feel the ribbon of cool against her cheek, and it was the most precious thing she had ever felt in her life, more precious than water, more precious than shade, because she had built it, and it was holding. Day 3. The heat did not relent. 111 degrees by the official reading at the trading post. Though Silas Red had no proper thermometer and the number was likely conservative. The air tasted metallic. No clouds, no wind after the squall passed. The valley lay under the sun like something being cured. Eliza stayed inside with the children. She rationed water. She rationed movement. She wet rags and draped them over Owen's chest and forehead, and replaced them when they dried, which took 15 minutes. Ruth read aloud from the Bible, not for faith, but for distraction, because a child reading aloud does not have space in her mind to be frightened, and Eliza needed Ruth not to be frightened. The buried pipe ran steady. The cool air spread across the floor in a pool that reached perhaps 6 feet from the opening before thinning to nothing. Within that pool, the air felt like late evening, not comfortable, not pleasant, but survivable. Outside that pool, the room was July in Arizona territory, which is to say it was not a room, but a slow oven with walls. On the morning of day 3, Silas Red rode past the shack. He did not stop. He slowed his mule and looked at the sealed windows, the vent collar on the roof, the quiet yard. Then he rode on toward the Pritchard claim, where Curtis was trying to keep a sick calf alive by draping wet sacking over a fence rail for shade. That afternoon, word came by a freighter's boy that a teamster had collapsed at the freight camp 4 miles west. The man was 31, strong, experienced in heat. He had been loading a wagon in direct sun and went down without warning. By the time they carried him into a tent, he was seizing. Dr. Bell was called. The teamster died before Bell arrived. The news traveled the settlement the way fire travels dry grass. A strong man, dead, not old, not sick, not new to the territory, dead from heat in a single afternoon. If a man like that could die, what about the widow on the east bench with 2 children and a shack full of buried pipe? But the widow's children were alive. They lay on the floor of a cabin that breathed from the earth, and they slept, and their skin was warm but not burning, and their mother lay between them and the door, and the cool air moved across all 3 of them in a current so subtle it could only be felt on wet skin, and that current was the difference between the teamster's fate and theirs. Day 4. Owen spiked a fever. It came at noon without warning. He'd been resting quietly, sipping water, and then his body arched and his skin went from warm to scorching in what felt like minutes. Eliza pressed her hand to his forehead and pulled it back. His eyes were glassy. His breathing turned rapid and shallow, the panting rhythm of a body losing its ability to cool itself. The pipe air was not enough. It was cool, but Owen was generating heat from inside now. Fever heat, illness heat, the body fighting something that had nothing to do with the air temperature and everything to do with a 5-year-old constitution pushed past its limit by weeks of stress and heat and inadequate food. Eliza stripped him to his underclothes. She soaked every rag she had in water from the crock, warm water, the only water she had, and packed them around his neck, his wrists, his ankles, his groin. She positioned him directly over the pipe opening so the cool air hit his chest and face. She fanned him with the canvas while Ruth replaced the rags as they warmed. "I need Belle," Eliza said. "Ruth, go to the Pritchard place. Tell Nora I need the doctor. Tell her Owen is seizing." Ruth ran. 9 years old, running across baked ground and heat that had killed a grown teamster the day before. She ran because her mother told her to, and because her brother was on the floor with his eyes rolling, and because running was the only thing left that a 9-year-old could do. Nora came before Belle. She came with a bucket of water that was cooler than anything in Eliza's shack. She had drawn it from her root cellar, the deepest water on any nearby claim, and she came with Curtis's horse, and she sent the freighter's boy for Belle at a gallop. Nora knelt beside Owen. She felt his forehead. She looked at Eliza. "How long?" "An hour, maybe less." Nora soaked fresh rags in the cellar water and replaced the warm ones. The cooler water against Owen's skin produced an immediate visible response. His breathing slowed a fraction, his hands unclenched. The pipe air flowed across him from below, while the wet rags cooled him from above, and between the two forces the fever held at its peak instead of climbing. Bell arrived an hour later riding hard. He came through the door already reaching for his bag. He knelt beside Owen and checked pulse, temperature, pupils, skin elasticity. He turned to Eliza. "When did the fever start?" "Noon, maybe just before." "Has he had water?" "Small sips, he can't hold more." Bell looked at the pipe opening. He looked at the wet rags. He looked at the room, dim, sealed, the upper air hot, but the floor level cool enough to feel the difference on his knees. "The room is not killing him," Bell said, and there was something in his voice that Eliza had not heard before. Surprise. Quiet, professional surprise. The kind a man feels when the evidence contradicts the diagnosis. In any other cabin in this valley, a child with this fever and this heat would be past help by now. The fever is illness. The heat is not helping, but the room is not making it worse. He administered tincture of willow bark dissolved in water, spooned into Owen's mouth a half teaspoon at a time. He packed the boy's armpits with wet cloth. He instructed Eliza to continue the floor-level positioning and the pipe airflow and the regular replacement of wet rags. "Keep him here," Bell said. "Keep him low. Keep the air moving. I will return at dawn." He stood. He walked to the pipe opening and crouched one more time. He held his hand over the bore and felt the draft. Cool, steady, uninterrupted, drawn from 50 feet of buried earth while the valley outside burned at 111 degrees. Bell said nothing. He put his hat on and walked out. Owen's fever broke at 3 in the morning. Eliza was awake when it happened. She felt the change through the wet rag on his forehead, the heat receding like a tide going out, his skin cooling degree by degree until it matched the air from the pipe instead of fighting it. His breathing deepened, his hands uncurled. He turned on his side and slept the way a child is supposed to sleep, without effort, without fighting, without the taut rigidity of a body under siege. Eliza lay beside him on the floor and felt the cool air moving across both of them. She did not sleep. She lay with her blistered hand on Owen's chest and felt him breathe, and felt the pipe breathe, and felt the two rhythms align, her son and the earth, both steady, both holding, both alive. Day 5. The last day of the siege. 108 degrees, down from the peak, but still lethal, still pressing, still a weight on every living thing in the valley. Eliza kept the children inside. She kept the system running. She kept the rags wet and the water rationed and the pipe opening clear. Bell came at dawn as promised. He checked Owen and found the fever gone, the skin cool, the boy sitting up and drinking water without gagging. He checked Ruth, who was tired and sun-darkened but alert. He checked Eliza, whose hands were blistered and whose weight had dropped visibly in 5 days, whose eyes were hollow above cheekbones gone sharp, but whose voice was steady and whose children were alive. He stood in the center of the room. He turned slowly, the way a man turns in a cathedral, looking up. The vent collar sat above him, pulling hot air upward in a draft so faint it could not be seen but could be felt on an upraised palm. Below him, the pipe opening exhaled cool air across the floorboards, in a current that smelled of clay and mineral and earth, the smell of the ground 6 feet down where the sun had never reached, and the temperature answered to a different calendar than the one that governed the surface. Bell looked at Eliza. "I judged you by the means you lacked," he said. "I missed the machine you built." He said it without sentiment. He said it the way he said everything, precisely, because precision was the only kindness he trusted. But his eyes stayed on the pipe opening as he said it, and Eliza understood that this was not an apology. It was a reclassification. She had moved in his assessment from a woman he expected to bury a child to a woman who had engineered survival out of clay and air and 50 feet of buried earth. The heat broke on the evening of the 5th day. Not dramatically, there was no storm, no rain, no merciful wind. The temperature simply eased from 108 to 96 between sundown and midnight, and the difference felt like stepping into water after days in sand. The valley exhaled, cattle moved, dogs emerged from their trenches, and in Eliza's shack the pipe air felt almost cold against skin that had forgotten what cold meant. 5 days, 111 degrees at the peak, a roof vent that nearly failed, a child's fever that nearly won, and a buried pipe that breathed cool air from the earth into a room that should have been a coffin and held and held and held. The teamster at the freight camp was dead. The Beaver Creek family had moved their children outdoors and covered them in wet quilts and prayed, and the children survived, but only just. Curtis Pritchard's calf had died on day 3. 2 horses at the relay station had gone down and not risen, but in the shack on the east bench were Dr. Amos Bell had said a child would be buried before the month broke. 2 children slept on the floor beside a pipe opening that breathed the earth's own air, and they slept deeply, and they slept cool, and they were alive. The morning after the siege broke, Eliza opened the cabin door and stood in the yard for the first time in 3 days. The light was the same. The ground was the same. The ridge to the west stood in the same white glare it had worn all summer. Nothing about the Verde country had changed. The heat would return, not today, perhaps not this week, but it would return because that is what desert heat does. It does not negotiate, and it does not forgive, and it does not remember that it already tried to kill you once. But the shack behind her breathed. She could hear it if she listened, not a sound exactly, but an absence of the stillness that had defined every room she had entered since arriving in the territory. The air moved. The vent pulled. The pipe exhaled. And inside, 2 children slept on the floor in a pool of cool air drawn from 50 feet of buried earth, and they had slept through a 5-day siege that killed a teamster and dropped a calf and sent a family on Beaver Creek scrambling to save their children with wet quilts and prayer. Eliza did not rest that morning. She walked to the wash and checked the intake. She climbed the roof and checked the vent collar. She ran her hand along the sealed floor joint and felt for leaks. The system was intact. It had held through the worst heat the valley had delivered in 3 years, through a dust squall that shifted the cap, through a child's fever that nearly broke her, and it was still running. She sat on the step and drank water from a crock that had stayed cool inside the cabin. The water tasted of clay and mineral. It tasted like the ground. The first visitor came before noon. His name was Abel Worley, the stock hand who had watched Silas offer his predatory note and had looked at Eliza in the trench the way a man looks at someone already finished. He came on foot, hat in hand, and he did not greet her with pleasantries. "My wife is poorly," he said. The heat took her hard. She cannot cool down even with the windows open. Bell says to keep her inside and keep her wet, but inside is hotter than outside and the water is warm. I heard your cabin is different. It is different, Eliza said. Can I see? She showed him. She walked him through the cabin, the pipe opening low in the floor, the vent collar on the roof, the buried line running 50 feet to the shaded intake in the wash. Worley crouched beside the pipe opening and held his hand over it for a long time, feeling the draft, his face changing the way Nora's face had changed. the expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about a woman and a trench. "How deep?" he asked. 6 feet at this end, falls to 4 at the intake. "How long did it take?" 21 days. With help. "What kind of pipe?" "Vitrified clay, 4-inch bore. The joints are sealed with clay and straw and ash." Worley stood. He looked at the room. He looked at Owen, who was sitting up now, drinking water, color returned to his face. He looked at Ruth, who was sweeping the floor near the pipe opening, with the focused attention of a child who has learned that keeping the vent clear is not a chore but a responsibility. "I don't know if I can dig 6 feet," Worley said. "The ground on my claim is harder than here." "Mateo can show you where the soft seams run," Eliza said. "And 3 feet is better than nothing. 5 is better than 3. The deeper the pipe, the cooler the air. But any depth below the scorch line will help." Worley left. He came back the next day with his wife's brother, and the 2 men stood in Eliza's yard while she walked them through the system a second time. Intake, pipe, grade, joints, outlet, vent. She drew the layout in the dirt with a stick, marking depths and distances, and the men listened the way men listen when they have decided the person speaking knows something they need, regardless of whether the person speaking is someone they would normally take instruction from. The second visitor was a woman named Clara Dunn, married to a teamster who ran the freight camp where the man had died. Clara had 3 children under 7 and a tent with no ventilation, and a husband who was gone 2 weeks out of every month. She had survived the siege by moving her children to the root cellar of a neighboring claim, but the root cellar was damp and cramped, and not hers to use long term. "I cannot dig a trench," Clara said. "I have no one to help, and no pipe." "You have neighbors," Eliza said, "and there is pipe on the old ditch line. I will show you what to look for." The third visitor was Dr. Amos Bell. He came on the 2nd day after the siege. In the late morning, when the heat was already building again, he tied his mare to the dead cottonwood, the same cottonwood he had tied her to 6 weeks ago when he had walked the property like a man walking a death scene, and he came to the door and removed his hat. "May I examine the system?" he asked. "Not the children. The system." Eliza noted the change and said nothing about it. She walked him through the full circuit, the intake and the wash, the pipe bore, the sealed joints visible where the trench remained open at 2 inspection points Mateo had insisted on leaving accessible. The pipe entry through the foundation sill, the floor outlet, the vent collar on the roof. Bell examined each component the way he examined a patient, methodically, without assumptions, looking for the mechanism rather than the symptom. At the intake, he held a lit match near the bore and watched the flame bend inward, drawn by the pull of the system. At the floor outlet, he placed his palm flat against the floorboard and felt the cool air spreading. "I have treated heat casualties for 21 years, Bell said. "I have recommended shade, water, rest, and relocation. I have never once recommended that someone bury a pipe in the ground and breathe from it. This is not a treatment I was trained to recognize." "It is not a treatment," Eliza said. "It is a building." "It is both," Bell said. "And I failed to see it." He turned to face her. There were 5 people in the yard now. Worley had returned with his brother-in-law, and Nora Pritchard had walked over when she saw Bell's horse. Bell spoke loudly enough that all of them heard. "I told Mrs. Voss that she would bury a child before July broke," he said. "I was wrong, not about the heat. The heat was as dangerous as I predicted. I was wrong about the woman. She built a machine I did not understand, and it saved her children when my recommendations would have required her to abandon her claim." He put his hat on. He nodded to Eliza once, and it was the nod of a man acknowledging a colleague, not a patient, and Eliza felt the weight of it, the difference between being helped and being recognized. Nora came forward after Bell rode away. She had been quiet during his speech, standing at the edge of the group with her arms crossed, her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who has spent 6 weeks watching something she was certain was madness turn into something she is now certain is sense. "I told you to dig for water," Nora said. "You did," Eliza said. "I was wrong. You brought buttermilk and corn and salt pork and cellar water when Owen was seizing." "That was not because I believed you." "I know," Eliza said. "It was because you are decent." Belief came later. Nora looked at the trench line running across the yard, at the intake box in the wash, at the vent collar on the roof. She looked back at Eliza. "Show me how to build one," Nora said. Matteo was there the next morning when Eliza began mapping a line for Nora's claim. He had brought his water level, his tamping bar, and a fresh bucket of sealing clay. He moved more slowly than he had 3 weeks ago. The siege had taken something from him, 5 days of heat on a 58-year-old body already carrying decades of kiln dust and desert labor. His breathing was shorter. His hands shook at the ends of long work, but his eye for grade was undiminished, and his hands still knew clay the way a musician's hands know an instrument. They spent the morning walking Nora's claim, reading the ground. The soil was harder than Eliza's, more calcium, less alluvial clay, but Matteo found a seam of softer ground that ran diagonal to the cabin and connected to a shallow wash where shade lasted most of the day. 35 feet here," he said, "not 50. The shade is closer. The depth can reach 5 feet in the soft seam. It will not cool as well as Eliza's, but it will cool." 35 feet is still a trench," Nora said, looking at the staked line. "Yes," Matteo said, "it is still a trench, and you will dig it, or the next siege will find you in a root cellar that belongs to someone else." He said it without cruelty. He said it the way he said everything, as fact, offered to a person he judged capable of hearing it. Nora looked at the stakes and then at Eliza, who was already unpacking the sealing clay. "I thought you were digging your own grave," Nora said quietly. "You told everyone I was," Eliza said. "I know, and I'm here now with a shovel, so perhaps we can call it even." They began Nora's trench that afternoon. Eliza set the grade. Matteo checked her work and corrected one slope error at the 20-foot mark, a belly where the line rose a 1/4 inch over 4 feet, invisible to the eye but enough to pool air and weaken the draw. "You see it now?" Matteo asked. "I see it," Eliza said. She had not seen it before he pointed, but she saw it now, and she knew she would see it next time without being told, and that was the lesson, not the correction, but the calibration of her eye. Over the following week, Matteo and Eliza worked together in a rhythm that had changed since the siege. Before the crisis, Matteo had led, and Eliza had followed. Now they worked side by side, and the instructions came less often, and when they came, they were shorter. A pointed finger, a head shake, a single word. The gap between teacher and student was narrowing, and both of them knew it, and neither spoke about it because the work was more eloquent than words. In the evenings after the digging stopped, they sat outside Eliza's cabin in the failing light and Matteo talked. Not about pipe or grade or clay, about other things. About the kilns in Sonora where he had burned lime as a young man and learned that fire has moods and clay has memory. About his wife, who had died of fever in '68, and his son, who worked silver mines near Tombstone and sent letters that arrived 3 weeks late and smelled of blasting powder. About the irrigation systems he had built for ranches in the Gila country, where the water ran cold from mountain snowmelt, and the ditches needed to be graded to the inch, or the fields drowned on one end and dried on the other. "Every system is the same argument," Matteo said one evening. "You are arguing with gravity, or with heat, or with water. The argument has rules. If you understand the rules, you can win the argument. If you do not understand them, the system wins and you lose. The Earth has rules, Eliza said. The Earth has the oldest rules. It was here before the heat, and it will be hereafter. You learned that young. Most people never learn it at all. He coughed then, a deep, wet cough that bent him forward and lasted long enough that Ruth looked up from the Bible she was reading by candlelight. Mateo waved her back with one hand and straightened slowly. Kiln dust, he said. It stays in the lungs. Eliza heard what he did not say. She heard it in the cough and in the shorter breath, and in the way he moved more carefully each day, placing his weight as if the ground beneath him had become uncertain. She heard it, and she did not ask about it, because asking would not change it, and because Mateo had taught her that the most respectful thing you can do for a person who understands their own situation is to let them name it in their own time. He named it 10 days later. They were finishing Nora's line, the last joint sealed, the floor outlet cut, the vent collar mounted. Mateo had sat down on the shaded side of the cabin wall after climbing off the roof, and he had not stood up for 20 minutes, and his breathing sounded like paper being crumpled slowly. I am going to leave before the next heat, he said. My son has a room in Tombstone. The elevation is better for the lungs. When? Before August. Eliza sat beside him. The shade was narrow, and their shoulders touched. The vent collar above them pulled a faint draft upward, the system already working even before the trench was fully backfilled. Before you go, Eliza said, I want to set a line alone. Start to finish. You watch. Mateo looked at her, then he nodded. Yes, he said. That is what should happen next. She set the line the following week. A short run, 20 feet, feeding a food alcove she was building against the north wall of her cabin. Branching from the main intake with a clay T-joint Mateo had shown her how to shape. She staked it, graded it, dug it, laid the pipe, sealed every joint, cut the outlet, and checked the draw. Mateo sat on an overturned crate and watched the entire process without speaking. When she finished, he walked the line. He checked the grade with the water level. He pressed each joint with his thumb. He crouched at the outlet and felt the draw. One joint is a quarter turn off center, he said. It will hold, but it will weaken first. Reset it now while the clay is soft. She reset it. He checked again. Good, he said, and then, you do not need me for this anymore. The air between them held something that neither of them tried to name. It was not sentimentality. It was the particular weight of a skill fully transferred, the moment when the teacher sees the student carry the work alone and knows that everything important has crossed over and will survive. Mateo left for Tombstone on the last day of July. He took the water level, the tamping bar, and a sack of tools on a borrowed mule. He left the bucket of sealing clay and a coil of cord marked at 1-foot intervals. Eliza walked him to the road. Ruth carried a bundle of dried corn for his journey. Owen, healthy now, tanned dark and moving with the energy of a child who had forgotten he was ever sick, ran alongside the mule and patted its flank until Mateo told him to let it walk. At the road, Mateo turned the mule and looked back at the claim. The trench line ran across the yard, backfilled now, the surface tamped flat, invisible unless you knew where to look. The vent collar stood above the roof, a small wooden tower that looked like nothing and meant everything. The intake box sat in the wash shade, screened and staked, breathing. The ground remembers what you bury in it, Mateo said. The pipe will outlast the cabin. When the boards rot and the tin rusts, the line will still be there. Someone will find it and wonder what it was, and if they are smart enough, they will feel the air and understand. He rode south. Eliza stood on the road until the dust settled. Then she turned back to the claim, where Ruth was already sweeping the floor near the pipe opening, and Owen was stacking sorted pipe shards in a line, smallest to largest, because that was the order Matteo had taught him. An order was how you kept a system alive. The evening was quiet. The air moved through the cabin in its slow circuit, up from the earth, across the floor, through the room, out through the vent collar into the violet sky. Eliza sat beside the pipe opening and placed her palm over the bore and felt the cool breath of the ground against her skin. It was the same coolness she had felt in the wash 6 weeks ago, the same coolness Prosper Cheney had shown her 20 years before. It had not changed. The Earth's temperature was a promise that did not depend on who was listening. She pressed her hand flat against the floorboard and let the air move between her fingers, and she stayed there until Ruth asked if supper was ready, and she said yes. And she stood, and the air kept moving. The secondary crisis came in the second week of August, and it came not from the sky, but from the road. A freight company had established a boarding shed at the relay stop 4 miles west, a long, low structure with plank walls and a tin roof where teamsters and travelers slept between runs. The shed held 12 cots in good weather. In August, the company packed in 22 men because the Prescott route was busy and every driver needed rest before the return haul. 22 men in a plank shed with a tin roof and no ventilation. The heat inside the shed by mid-afternoon exceeded the heat outside because 22 bodies generated warmth that had nowhere to go, and the tin roof absorbed sun all day and radiated it inward all night, and the single door at each end created a cross draft that moved hot air from one end to the other without cooling it. On the third day of a heat spell, not as severe as the July siege but dangerous, 106 at peak, 2 men collapsed inside the shed within an hour of each other. A third, older, went down that evening and could not be revived with water alone. Bell was called. He treated the men, stabilized the worst, and looked at the shed with the expression of a man who has seen the same failure repeated across 21 years and has run out of patience for it. He rode to Eliza's claim the next morning. "The boarding shed at the relay stop is killing men," he said. "The company will not spend money on modifications. I have told them what will happen, and they have told me it is not their concern, because the drivers are not employees. They are contractors." "What do you want me to do?" Eliza said. "I want you to look at the shed and tell me if your system can be made to work at that scale." Eliza had never built for 22 men. She had built for 2 children in a single room. The boarding shed was 4 times the size of her cabin, held 10 times the bodies, and sat on flat ground with no convenient wash or shaded intake point nearby. But the principles were the same. Hot air rises. Cool air enters from below. The earth keeps its own temperature. The system does not care whether the room holds 2 children or 22 teamsters. It cares about pipe diameter, trench depth, vent height, joint integrity, and the difference between the ground temperature and the air temperature. Scale the inputs and the output scales. Matteo was gone. She could not ask him. She could not check her reasoning against his eye or test her grade against his level. She had the cord he had left, marked at 1-foot intervals. She had the sealing clay. She had the principle. She walked to the relay stop that afternoon. She walked the shed. She measured the interior by pacing, 60 feet long, 14 wide. She looked at the roof, low, single pitch, tin, no vent of any kind. She looked at the ground, flat, hard, no wash nearby, but a shallow drainage swale ran behind the corral 50 feet north where a seasonal creek had cut a depression into softer ground. She sketched the design in the dirt outside the shed with a stick, and Bell watched, and 2 teamsters who had heard about the woman with the buried pipe watched from the corral fence. The design was larger, but the logic was identical. 3 intake lines instead of 1 running from the drainage swale to the shed at staggered intervals. Each line buried 4 to 5 feet deep, shallower than her cabin, because the ground here was harder and she had fewer hands. 3 low outlets cut through the shed floor at equal spacing. 1 central high vent cut through the roof at the ridge, tall enough to clear the heat layer by 2 feet. 3 lines, Eliza said, each 35 feet. The intakes staggered so they do not steal each other's air. The outlets placed so the cool air reaches every section of the floor. The vent must be taller than mine. The room is larger. The heat load is greater. The draw must be stronger. Who will dig 3 trenches? Bell asked. The men who sleep in the shed, Eliza said. They have the bodies. They lack the knowledge. I have the knowledge. They lack the motivation. You have the authority. Between the 3 of us, the shed breathes by next week. Bell looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the teamsters on the fence. You heard the woman, he said. Find shovels. They dug. 12 teamsters working in shifts of 4 because they could not all be in the trenches at once in the heat. Eliza set the grades. She staked the lines. She walked the cord and checked the water level and corrected the slopes where the men cut too deep or too shallow. She showed them how to seal joints with the clay compound and how to tamp the bedding so the pipe sat true. She taught the way Mateo had taught, through action, through correction, through the expectation that a person who could hold a shovel could learn to hold a standard. Ruth came with her. The girl carried the cord and the level and the marking pegs, and when Eliza was busy correcting a grade at one trench, Ruth checked the measurements at another and called out when the line deviated. She was 9 years old, and she was reading a water level with the precision of a ditch foreman's apprentice, and no one who watched her questioned it, because the trench she was checking was the trench that would cool the room where they slept. The work took 6 days. 3 trenches, each 35 feet, 105 feet of buried pipe in total, sealed and graded and connected to 3 floor outlets in the shed. The central vent was the hardest part, cutting through the tin roof, framing the collar, raising it high enough to draw. 2 teamsters did the roof work under Eliza's direction, and when the collar was set and the cap was mounted, one of them stood on the ridge and said he could feel the pull against his hand. Like a chimney, he said, but backward. Not backward, Eliza said. The same direction. Hot air out. Cool air in. The pipe just decides where the cool air comes from. On the 6th evening, they opened the system. 22 men lay on their cots in a shed that had been a tin coffin a week before, and the air that moved across the floor was not cold, was not even truly comfortable, but was different, cooler, slower, carrying the mineral smell of buried clay, and the difference was enough that men who had been sleeping in soaked undershirts now slept dry, and men who had woken gasping at midnight now slept through. Silas Red heard about the boarding shed. He heard about it the way he heard about everything, through the ledger of debts and favors that constituted his understanding of the settlement. He heard that Eliza Voss had redesigned the relay shed and that Teamsters were talking about her system as far as Prescott. He heard that Bell was recommending buried pipe to anyone who asked about heat management. He heard that Nora Pritchard's cabin now had its own line and that Worley was halfway through his. Silas did not come to congratulate. He came to the trading post and told 3 men drinking coffee that the pipe system was a curiosity that worked once in soft ground and would fail in harder soil, and that anyone who paid for pipe would be wasting money they did not have. Then he came to Eliza's claim. He rode the same mule he had ridden the day he offered her $5 against her title. He dismounted and stood in the yard and looked at the vent collar on the roof and the sealed trench line running across the yard and the intake box and the wash. You have made yourself the talk of the settlement, he said. I have made a pipe that cools a room, Eliza said, and now you are giving it away, teaching Teamsters, teaching Worley, Teaching Nora. You could charge for this. Pipe, labor, instruction. A woman in your position could build a business. A woman in my position built a system to keep her children alive, Eliza said. I am not interested in your version of a business. Silas's face tightened. He had not come to praise her. He had come to find the angle, the way to insert himself between the innovation and the people who needed it. The way he inserted himself between every scarcity and every need in the settlement, taking a cut, holding a note, owning a piece. I can supply pipe, he said. Vitrified clay, freight rate, delivered to the claim. I can arrange labor. I can offer terms. Your terms put a lien on people's claims, Eliza said. You offered me $5 against my title. You told me no decent mother would gamble on dirt and pipe. Now you want to sell the pipe. She said it in the yard, in the open, where Worley's brother-in-law was passing on the road and where Nora was visible a quarter-mile away, walking toward the well. She said it clearly and without anger because the facts were sufficient and anger would have diminished them. Silas mounted his mule. You will run out of free pipe, he said. And when you do, your neighbors will come to me, because I am the one with supply. He rode away. Eliza watched him go and understood that the battle had shifted. It was no longer about whether the system worked. It was about who controlled it. She went inside and sat beside the pipe opening and felt the cool air against her wrist. Owen was asleep on the floor. Ruth was marking a sheet of brown paper with the layout of Clara Dunn's proposed trench line, distances, depths, intake location, drawn in charcoal with a steady hand, and Mateo's 1-foot cord lying beside her like a ruler. Eliza looked at her daughter drawing a pipe grade with the competence of someone who had watched it done 20 times and understood it, and she understood that the knowledge had already spread further than Silas could contain. It was in Ruth's hands. It was in the teamsters who had dug the boarding shed trenches. It was in Nora's sealed joints and Worley's staked line. The system did not belong to Eliza any more than the ground belonged to the sun. It belonged to whoever learned it, and Eliza had chosen to teach it freely, and that choice was the one thing Silas Red could not put a lien against. Outside, the evening air was still warm. The vent collar pulled its slow draft upward. The intake breathed in the wash shade. And somewhere south, on a road to Tombstone, a man with kiln-scarred hands and shortened breath carried the memory of every joint he had sealed and every grade he had checked, and the memory would outlast his lungs, because he had given it to someone who would use it. By September of 1888, 7 cabins in the Verde corridor had buried pipe running beneath their floors. Eliza had set 4 of the grades herself. Ruth had assisted on 3. Worley and his brother-in-law had dug their own and then helped a cattle family named Beecham dig theirs, passing along the joint sealing technique Eliza had taught them, with the same clay straw ash compound Mateo had mixed on her claim 4 months before. The knowledge moved the way water moves through a grade, following the path of least resistance, gathering speed, finding its own level. No one organized it. No one appointed Eliza as teacher. People came because the heat was real, and the pipe was real, and the difference between a cabin with buried air and a cabin without was the difference between sleeping and lying awake at midnight, wondering if your child would still be breathing at dawn. A typical morning on Eliza's claim that September looked nothing like the desperate digging of June. Ruth woke early and checked the intake screen for debris, a daily habit Mateo had established and Ruth had adopted as her own. Owen carried the water crocks to the cistern with a yoke that was now sized for his shoulders, a smaller version of the one Mateo had shaped for Ruth. Eliza spent the first hours reviewing trench plans that settlers had brought her, scratched on brown paper, on the backs of feed receipts, on flat stones carried in pockets. Each plan showed a cabin layout, a proposed pipe run, an intake location. Each plan contained errors that Eliza could identify at a glance because Mateo had calibrated her eye, and she corrected them the way he had corrected hers, with a finger on the paper and a single sentence explaining why. Your intake sits in full sun after 10 o'clock. Move it 8 feet south where the bank overhangs. Your grade reverses at the midpoint. The belly will pool air and kill the draw. Dig 2 inches deeper between these marks. Your vent collar is too low. The heat layer in a room this size sits 3 feet below the ceiling. The collar must clear it by 18 inches minimum, or you are venting warm air, not hot. The teaching happened not as lectures, but as corrections. And the corrections happened not in a schoolroom, but on the ground, with the cord and the water level and the ceiling clay. Eliza walked claim after claim that September, her boots red with other people's dirt, her hands moving from pipe to joint to vent collar, with the automatic fluency of a person who has done a thing so many times that the body remembers it before the mind. She taught men who had dismissed her in June, and women who had whispered about her in July, and she taught them without reminding them of either, because the system was more important than the grudge, and the children in those cabins were more important than the system. One afternoon, she taught a group of 3. Worley, the Beecham boy, who was 16 and strong, and a woman named Etta Polk, whose husband had been crippled by a mule kick and could not dig. They stood in Etta's yard around a staked line, and Eliza walked the cord with the water level the way Mateo had walked it on her trench 3 months before. Watch the water, she said. When the bubble sits centered, the cord is level, but the cord must not be level. The pipe must fall. A finger's width over 10 feet. If the water sits slightly high on the intake side, the grade is correct. The Beecham boy squinted at the glass tube. How do you know a finger's width is enough? Because I built one that fell less than a finger's width and the draw died at the midpoint. And I built one that fell more and the air moved too fast and carried dust into the room. A finger's width is the argument the pipe wins. She did not charge. She had considered it. The pipe cost labor and the labor cost food, and the food cost money she still barely had. But she could not reconcile taking payment for knowledge that Mateo had given freely and that Prosper Cheney had given her freely before that. The system was not hers. It was the Earth's. She had merely learned to read it. The refusal to charge drove Silas Red to a fury he could not afford to show. Silas had positioned himself as the pipe supplier within 2 weeks of the boarding shed installation. He had freighted vitrified clay pipe from Prescott at marked-up rates, offering terms, always with a note attached, always with a lien embedded in the small letters that most settlers could not read or chose not to question. 3 families had purchased pipe from Silas on credit. 2 of those families had installed it themselves, following Eliza's instructions. One had hired a man Silas recommended, a former ditcher named Kern, who had watched one trench being dug and declared himself expert. Kern's installation on the Aldrich claim failed within a week. The grade was off by 2 inches over 20 feet, a belly at the midpoint that pooled cool air in the pipe and prevented it from reaching the cabin. The joints were sealed with river clay that cracked as it dried, allowing hot surface air to leak into the bore and mix with the cooled air, raising the temperature of the output to nearly ambient. The vent collar sat 6 inches too low, pulling warm air from the middle of the room instead of the hottest layer at the ceiling. The Aldrich family, a teamster, his wife, and a 3-year-old daughter, spent 4 nights in a cabin that was supposed to be cooled and was not. And on the 5th night, the daughter developed heat rash so severe that Bell was called and threatened to report the freight company if the relay road was not made safer for families. Eliza heard about the failure from Nora. She walked to the Aldrich claim the same afternoon. She descended into the inspection trench that Kern had left open and ran her hand along the pipe. She felt the joints, cracked, dry, gritty, with infiltration. She sighted the grate and saw the belly immediately. She climbed out and looked at the vent collar, which sat barely a foot above the ridgeline. "Who set this grade?" Eliza asked. "Kern," Aldrich said. "Silas recommended him." "Kern does not know how to set a grade," Eliza said. "The belly at the midpoint is killing your draw. The joints are sealed with the wrong clay, river clay cracks. It must be mixed with straw and ash. The vent is too low. None of this would have passed inspection on any line I have set." She said it plainly, in front of Aldrich and his wife and two neighbors who had come to see what had gone wrong. She did not name Silas. She did not need to. Everyone in the settlement knew who had recommended Kern and who had sold the pipe and who had written the note that the Aldrich family now owed against their claim. Eliza spent the next 2 days correcting the installation. She regraded the belly section, excavating the pipe, adjusting the trench floor, resetting each joint with the proper compound, while Aldrich held the pipe steady and his wife kept the 3-year-old occupied with a rag doll in the shade. She resealed every connection, 11 joints, each one packed, smoothed, and tamped the way Mateo had shown her on the first day of their partnership. She raised the vent collar 18 inches, reframed the throat, and angled the cap for the prevailing westerly. When she finished, the draw resumed. She held a strip of cloth over the outlet and watched it flutter inward, steady, alive. The room cooled. The Aldrich daughter slept through the night for the first time in a week, her skin clear, her breathing easy. Eliza did not charge the Aldrich family. The correction was not a favor. It was a statement, and the statement was heard in every cabin and every camp along the corridor. The woman who built the first trench did not sell what she knew, and the man who sold what he did not know had put a child at risk. Silas felt it. He felt it in the silence that followed him into the trading post, in the way men who had smiled at his jokes now looked at their boots when he spoke, in the way women who had taken his credit now paid in coin and asked for their notes back. His position in the settlement had been built on being the man between the need and the supply, and Eliza had removed him from the middle of the one thing that mattered most that summer, the ability to survive heat. He did not confront her directly. He retreated into the trading post and adjusted his ledger and waited, because Silas Red was a patient man, and patient men outlast confrontation. But the ground had shifted under him the way ground shifts under a badly graded pipe, and he could feel the belly forming in his own position, and he did not know how to correct it. The resolution came in October, not from pride, but from Tin and Son. Silas's storeroom sat behind the trading post, a long, narrow structure with a tin roof and board walls, used for storing dry goods, leather, grain, and the ledger books that constituted his power. The storeroom had no ventilation. It had never needed ventilation because Silas had always conducted business in the cooler months and retreated to the post's front porch during summer, leaving the storeroom sealed. But October of 1888 brought a late-season heat surge, 4 days above 100 degrees, unusual for the month, brutal enough to warp candle tallow and turn butter to oil. The storeroom, sealed and unventilated, became an oven. Grain heated and soured. Leather dried and cracked in seams. She was in the yard, checking a trench layout that Clara Dunn's husband had sketched on a piece of sacking. Ruth was marking depths on the sketch with charcoal, the 1-foot cord lying beside her like a ruler. Owen was sorting pipe shards, still sorting, still arranging by size, the habit Mateo had given him now as natural as breathing. Silas dismounted. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. His fingers worked the brim the way a man works a coin when he does not want to say what he has come to say. Eliza waited. She did not help him. "I need the pipe system," Silas said, "for my storeroom." "You said it was a curiosity," Eliza said. "You said it would fail in hard ground." "My ground is hard," I need it anyway. You sent Kern to the Aldrich place. He sealed joints with river clay and set a grade with a belly that killed the draw. Their daughter could not sleep for a week. Silas's mouth thinned. He was not accustomed to having his record read back to him. He was accustomed to reading other people's records, in ink, in ledger books that listed what they owed. I will pay, he said. Name a price. I do not charge for instruction, Eliza said, but I do not dig for people who can dig for themselves. You have 2 arms and a mule. I will set the grade and check the joints. You will dig the trench, haul the pipe, and seal the connections. And you will do it yourself, not through Kern, and not through credit. Silas looked at her. He looked at Ruth, who had stopped marking the sketch and was watching with the clear, unblinking gaze of a child who has learned to read power the way other children read books. He looked at Owen, who was still sorting pipe shards, and had not looked up because a man standing in the yard asking for help was no longer unusual and did not require his attention. Fine, Silas said. He dug the trench himself, 25 feet from a shallow swale behind the corral to the storeroom's north wall, 4.5 feet deep where the ground allowed, sealed with compound, Eliza mixed and handed to him in a bucket. She set the grade. She checked his joints, twice resealing connections where his clay work was sloppy, showing him the pressure test each time, pressing her thumb against the seal and watching for give. She raised his vent collar to the proper height and showed him how to angle the cap for crosswind draw. Silas worked in silence through 2 full days, sweating through his shirt, his hands blistering on the shovel handle, his boots caked with the red clay he had spent the summer dismissing as the material of a mad woman's delusion. On the second evening, Worley passed on the road and stopped his horse and watched Silas Red standing waist-deep in a trench on his own property, packing a pipe joint with straw clay, while Eliza Voss stood above him and said, "Tamp the bedding tighter. If the pipe shifts, the joint cracks." Worley said nothing. He did not need to. The image was sufficient. When the system was finished and the draw confirmed, Silas stood in his storeroom and felt the cool air moving across the floor where his ledger books sat on a low shelf. The air smelled of clay and mineral. The books were safe. The grain would keep. The leather would hold. He did not thank Eliza. She did not expect thanks. What she had extracted was more valuable. The sight of Silas Red digging his own trench in full view of the settlement, doing the work he had mocked and then monetized and then failed to understand. That was not revenge. It was correction, and correction in the Verde country was more humiliating than any speech because it was witnessed and remembered and talked about at the store for years afterward, in the particular tone people use when they are telling a story they enjoyed watching happen. Thomas Hale arrived in November. He was 34, a widower, a carpenter by trade who had lost his wife to typhus in Tucson the previous spring and had come north to the Verde country looking for work and distance from a house that still smelled like the cloths they had boiled during the fever. He was lean and quiet and built things with a precision that Eliza recognized immediately. The precision of someone who understood that a structure is an argument with gravity and the argument has rules. He came because Bell had written to a colleague in Tucson, mentioning the pipe system and the woman who had built it, and Bell's colleague had mentioned it to Hale, and Hale had been curious enough to ride 4 days north to see a buried airline for himself. He arrived at Eliza's claim on a Monday morning. She was on the roof adjusting the vent collar's wind cap for the seasonal shift. The prevailing wind direction changed in autumn, and the cap needed to be rotated 15 degrees to maintain crosswind draw. Hale watched her work from the yard. He watched the way she handled the tin, bending it with a handbrake she had fashioned from a plank and 2 clamps, cutting it with shears, fitting the new angle by feel, and then checking it by holding a strip of cloth over the throat to see the pull. "That is a well-set collar," he said when she climbed down. "It took 3 tries to get right," Eliza said. "The first one blew off in a squall. The second sat too low. This one holds." "May I see the full system?" She showed him. He spent 2 hours examining every component with the methodical attention of a man who builds for a living and understands that details are not decoration but structure. He measured the vent collar dimensions with a folding rule he carried in his vest. He inspected the pipe joints through the access trenches, pressing each seal with his thumb the way Matteo used to. He lay on the cabin floor with his cheek against the boards and felt the air from the pipe opening move across his face, staying there for a full minute, his eyes closed, thinking. "I build porches and shade walls," he said when he stood. "I've built double roofs for heat shedding, air gap between the layers so the sun heats the outer skin and the inner skin stays cooler. I've never seen anyone route the air through the ground first. This changes the sequence." "What sequence?" "The order in which you fight heat. Most builders start at the roof, shade, reflective paint, double layer, ventilation. You start it underground. By the time the air reaches the room, it has already been cooled. The roof work becomes the exit, not the defense. You reverse the logic." Eliza liked him because he saw the system, not the story. He did not ask about the husband or the hardship or the $11. He asked about pipe diameter and joint compound and whether a longer buried run would produce cooler output, and Eliza answered with the specificity of a woman who had spent 4 months learning the answers through labor and failure and corrections called down from the edge of a trench by a man who understood clay the way she now understood it herself. They worked together for the first time the following week, building a shaded porch extension on the Beecham cabin that incorporated a secondary intake vent fed by the buried line. Hale framed the porch, mortise and tenon, no nails where it mattered, the joints fitted so tight a knife blade would not pass between them. Eliza ran the pipe. Where their skills overlapped, the vent collar where carpentry met airflow, they negotiated the joint design across 2 afternoons of quiet argument that ended in a hybrid collar neither of them would have built alone. And when they tested the draw and felt the pull, they looked at each other across the roof ridge, and the look carried the particular quality of 2 people who have discovered that someone else's competence does not diminish their own, but enlarges it. The courtship happened through shared work the way frontier courtships often did, not through parlor conversation or Sunday walks, but through measurements discussed over morning coffee, through a disagreement about vent collar height on the Polk cabin that lasted 3 days and ended in a compromise Eliza privately admitted was better than her original specification, through evenings on the step of the cabin where Hale told her about the houses he had built in Tucson and the one house he could not go back to, and Eliza told him about Matteo's kilns and Prosper's culverts, and the first morning in the wash when the air moved against her wrist and everything changed. They married in March of 1889, a year after Eliza had arrived in the Verde country with a husband who promised land and left her with a shack that tried to kill her children. The ceremony was small. Belle attended. Nora stood as witness. Owen carried the rings on a scrap of the flour sack Eliza had used to wrap her bleeding hands during the first week of digging. Ruth had saved the scrap and sewn it into a small pouch, and the gesture carried a weight that no one in the room tried to put into words because the words were not necessary and the pouch said enough. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the work becomes the life instead of the interruption. Hale built vent housings and shade structures. Eliza set grades and trained diggers. Together they developed refinements, deeper shaded intake chambers lined with flat stone for sustained coolness, removable dust screens that could be cleaned monthly without breaking the seal, double wall vent collars that reduce backdraft and crosswind, exterior trellises of woven ocotillo on the south walls of cabins that cut radiant heat before it reached the boards. Each improvement was tested in their own cabin first, then taught to whoever came to learn. Ruth grew precise. By 12, she could set a 50-foot grade without correction. By 14, she was teaching the water level to younger children the way Mateo had taught it to her mother, by walking the cord, checking the glass tube, and saying, "The pipe must fall. If it rises anywhere, the air meets a wall." The words were Mateo's. The voice was hers. The knowledge had traveled from a kiln burner's hands through a desperate woman's labor into a girl's steady instruction, and it would travel further, because that is what knowledge does when it is given freely. Owen, the boy who had lain on the floor with glassy eyes and a fever that nearly killed him, grew into the work differently. He did not set grades or teach the water level. He dug. He was strong and patient, and he dug intake chambers for new arrivals with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone who understood that the earth was not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be opened. He could not remember the fever. He could not remember the 5-day siege, or the night his mother climbed onto a burning roof to reset a vent cap with blistered hands. But his body remembered the floor. His body remembered the cool air moving across his chest, and he returned to that memory every time he opened the ground for someone else's children. A letter came from Tombstone in the spring of 1890. It was from Mateo's son. Mateo had died in January, the lungs finally closing on the kiln dust that had lived in them for 30 years. He had spent his last months building a flue system for a bakery near the mine works, the son wrote, and the system still ran, and the bakers called it the coolest room in Tombstone. Eliza read the letter on the step of the cabin, in the same spot where she and Mateo had sat on the evenings when he talked about kilns and gravity and the rules the earth keeps. She folded the letter and placed it inside the Bible she no longer opened, beside the space where $11 had once been pressed flat between the pages of Psalms. Then she walked to the pipe opening in the floor and placed her palm over the bore and felt the air, cool, steady, carrying the smell of clay and mineral and earth 6 feet down, and she stayed there until the feeling in her chest became something she could carry rather than something that carried her. And then she stood, and she went outside, and she continued the work. By the summer of 1891, 14 homesteads and 2 commercial buildings in the Verde corridor used buried intake lines. The first copy had been Nora's, the second, the boarding shed at the relay stop. By the time new families arrived from Prescott or Tucson or the mining camps to the south, someone pointed not to the well first, but to the spot on the ground where a cool intake could be buried. The method spread because Eliza taught it freely, and because everyone who had lived through the July siege of '88 remembered the week when one cabin felt like mercy while the rest of the valley baked. Eliza lived out her later years in the Verde country, not rich, not celebrated, beyond the corridor, but never again dismissed as helpless. She set grades into her 60s, her eyes still calibrated to the quarter inch, her hands still carrying the white scars from the first week of digging when the grubbing hoe bounced off Kate and her palms split along every finger. Hale built beside her until his own health failed, and after he was gone, she continued alone, because alone was where she had started, and alone was not the same word as helpless and never had been. On a September evening near the end, her hair gone silver and thin, she sat on the cabin step with her granddaughter beside her, and her hand resting over the floor vent, feeling the air move between her fingers the way it had moved every day since the system first drew breath, and she told the girl about a man named Prosper Cheney, who had once placed a child's hand inside a buried clay pipe and said the ground keeps its own temperature, and the girl listened, and the air moved, and the knowledge passed. On the 14th of July, 1888, the temperature in the Verde country had climbed past 111 degrees and held there for 5 days, and Dr. Amos Bell had stood in a board shack on the east bench and told a woman with $11 and 2 children, "If you keep those children in this box through July, you will bury one before the month breaks." The box did not bury anyone. The same roof that had trapped heat learned to release it through a wooden collar Eliza Voss raised 26 inches above the ridgeline with blistered hands and scavenged tin. The same floor that had burned through socks carried a ribbon of air drawn from 50 feet of buried clay pipe, cooled by earth that the sun had never reached, pushed into the room by the simple, ancient insistence of hot air rising and cool air following. Bell had stood in the doorway after the siege with his hat in his hands and said nothing at all because the room said it for him, cool where it should have been killing, quiet where it should have been desperate, alive where he had predicted death. Outside, the yard still shimmered. The sun was still merciless. Nothing about the desert had grown kind. What changed was that one woman stopped fighting the heat in the open and taught the earth to take the burden instead. The last image is dust. A thin